Mr. President! President Zelensky, can you make up with Donald Trump?
Can you still work with President Trump?
You can win the war without America, Mr. President.
The elites in America will think that it was we were ganging up on him, but the majority of Americans will, I think, see what Donald Trump has to deal with.
Minister, are you the person who can...
That's what was so tragic about it, because in this conversation, everybody was talking past themselves.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you.
Zelensky doesn't understand that he is a subordinate. I know I feel for him because they've lost so many people, but you don't come into the White House with your trademark T-shirt.
President Trump, what's your message to Vladimir Putin, sir? President Trump, President Trump, do you have a message for Vladimir Putin as you meet with President Zelensky today?
Why is it okay to call President Zelensky a dictator, but not, as you say, call Vladimir Putin names?
Why don't you wear a suit? Why don't you wear a suit? You're the highest level in this country's office, and you refuse to wear a suit. Just want to see if do you own a suit?
Yeah, problems.
A lot of Americans have problems with you not respecting the dignity of this office.
So we've spent 3 years calling Vladimir Putin names. That's not the point. The point that we're at now is we're trying to get the man to a table, the Russians. And I would ask everybody this. If there are no negotiations, what is the alternative? Another 4 years of war, another 3 years of war, in which the United States and Europe continues to pour billions of dollars into a war in Ukraine? Is that the alternative?
If you don't understand the nuances of the English language, you don't interrupt the President of the United States.
Tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. Remember this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
Influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now.
And if you're J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, you got to be careful about the optics. Yes, MAGA supports you and the Americans support you for defending our interests, but it looks like two tall, big men are kind of ganging up on this little Zelensky. So those were not good optics for either one.
News outlets and public figures noted that Vance and Trump confronted Zelensky in a tense exchange, accusing him of ingratitude for U.S. support and disrespect toward Trump's efforts to broker peace with Russia.
Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you?
Stephen King's comment on X labeled them bullies who don't do shame, reflecting a sentiment echoed by critics. Senator Chris Murphy called it an utter embarrassment, suggesting Vance escalated a diplomatic meeting into a hostile confrontation. Articles from The Independent, The Guardian, and Politico, among others, used terms like berating and ambushing to describe Vance's actions, fueling the bullying narrative. Shortly after the Zelensky meeting, Vance arrived in Vermont, planning a family ski trip at Sugarbush Resort in Warren. By March 1st, hundreds of protesters lined roads near the resort, particularly along Route 100 in Waitsfield, about a mile away. These demonstrations, organized by grassroots groups like Indivisible Mad River Valley, were initially planned earlier in the week to oppose Trump administration policies, but gained momentum after the Zelensky clash. Protesters waved Ukrainian flags and held signs like "Vance is a traitor, go ski in Russia," expressing outrage over the Oval Office exchange and broader administration actions. Some even gathered near ski lifts at Sugarbush, though the resort reported minimal disruption. The protests were intense enough that Vance and his family reportedly moved to an undisclosed location, cutting their trip short.
The tragedy of this open spat is, if you think about it, they were very close to an agreement. And what is that agreement? There's only one real issue separating Russia now from Ukraine and the United States participation, and that is, how far can you push Putin back? We know now that Ukraine will not be in NATO. We know it's armed to the teeth, and it's more deterrent than any NATO power. We know that it was never the policy of prior administrations to forcibly take back with military means the Donbass and Crimea. Putin can brag that he institutionalized. We're just talking about where the DMZ is, how close it will be to the embarkation point that Vladimir Putin launched from on February 24th of 2022.
Seems to be getting lost in what we're seeing in President Zelensky's statements in the White House and the European leaders' response to this. President Trump recognizes the urgent need to end this war after 3 long, bloody years, and has proven that he is the only person that can do this.
Donald Trump is saying that the United States is very tired of subsidizing and paying for far distant problems when we're running a $37 trillion national debt. This war was on the border of Europe. They said they were going to invest 2% of their GDP as NATO powers in defense. They didn't do it. We have outfunded all of them, and yet we are very distant with an open border ourselves. If we want to be there, we want some compensation. You have valuable minerals, we'll come in and have a concession with you, a business deal.
Ukraine possesses significant mineral wealth, with estimates valuing its reserves at approximately $26 trillion. These resources include substantial deposits of critical minerals such as titanium, lithium, graphite, and uranium, which are essential for various industries, including defense, technology, and energy. In early 2025, the US and Ukraine engaged in negotiations over a deal granting the US access to Ukraine's vast mineral reserves. President Trump proposed that Ukraine allocate 50% of its revenues from natural resources, minerals, gas, and oil into a US-controlled fund until it reached $500 billion, framing it as repayment for US military aid. However, President Zelensky rejected the terms, citing concerns over fairness and sovereignty, insisting that aid should not be treated as debt without security guarantees. Efforts to reach a compromise failed, culminating in a heated White House confrontation on February 28, 2025, which led to the deal's collapse, highlighting the geopolitical complexities of resource diplomacy.
If we have a negotiated settlement, the critical point will be, can Donald Trump put Putin back where he was before he invaded this time? That was can he go back to February 23rd of 2022? And Trump will tell him, you're not going to be worried about Ukraine. It's not going to be in NATO. You can go tell all of your friends that you institutionalized the acquisition of Crimea and the Donbass. But we would like you to re-enter the family of nations. We would like you to be able to sell and buy things if we drop sanctions. But for us to do that, it would be wise for you to go back and we'll make a Korea-like DMZ. And that is the negotiation that's transpiring right now. Vladimir Putin is a dictator, and he's a violent dictator, and he's a corrupt dictator, and he's an aggressive dictator. But compared to Joseph Stalin, he's an amateur. We had a formal alliance with the Soviet Union because they were the enemy of our enemy, Nazi Germany. Richard Nixon talked to Mao Zedong to try to play him off against the Soviets. So there's a long history of realpolitik, of talking to odious dictators if it's in the U.S. interest and it lessens the chance of war.
President Zelensky has different aims in mind. He has said that he wants to end this war, but he will only accept an end, apparently, that leads to what he views as Ukraine's victory, even if it comes at an incredibly high cost. President Trump is committed to peace and to freedom.
Donald Trump himself said he wanted to push Putin as far back as possible. That's why this mineral agreement was so innovative, because most of the key deposits are along this disputed area. If you can come up with a DMZ close to or near where Putin started the war, and he did start the war, and have concessions where Europeans and Americans come in and have personnel on the ground, and it's a prosperous, mutually advantaged concession, then you're going to have the beginning of a lasting peace. Putin will not go in there and kill Americans or disrupt that, but the key will be to push him back. We say we're not putting troops there. We are not putting troops there, but we're going to profit from it along with Ukraine. It'll enrich Ukraine. We'll get Europeans, and there will be a commercial corridor, and Putin will not go in there, because if he does, he will face some consequences. And that's all I don't understand why Zelensky couldn't have just said, let's just do the mineral deal now. I don't think Mr. Zelensky understands that the United States is the only key to his survival. And he further does not understand, I wish he did, that we give him allowances that we do not give other clients. The people that Zelensky does not feel comfortable with or doesn't like, the MAGA movement, the conservative Republicans, they have the power over his fate. And the people that he dalliances with and he feels comfortable and he's a rock star with, the Europeans and the American left, don't have any power. The Europeans talk a great game, but they have not come through with the economic and financial and military assistance as was promised. And the American left that has made him a rock star, they're not in power now. He has to get along with the president. That means you come in with a suit, you're very polite, you do not interrupt, and you cut a deal that's mutually beneficial on the mineral concession. That creates a de facto commercial tripwire, roughly along a DMZ, and now you have the basis for a lasting peace.
Of course, both sides are going to have their arguments and their interests that they are fighting for. This is the reality of how these negotiations always occur during times of war. Neither side is going to be happy, very likely, with the outcome, but ultimately it needs to lead to peace. And that's what President Trump is so committed to, because he recognizes that the longer this goes on, not only are more Ukrainians losing their lives, but it increases the potential of this escalation towards World War III that he warned against.
I've asked every foreign minister I meet with, tell me your idea of how this turns out. Most don't have a plan. A few have said, well, let's give them another year of fighting. A year from now, a year later, after another year of death, another year of destruction, then maybe Putin will be ready to negotiate at that point. That doesn't sound like a good plan to me, and it certainly is not a plan the president's on board.
I wish that today, as I'm speaking, or in the ensuing week, the two sides can come back together, because we're very, very close to a peace, and it's in Donald Trump's interest to get the credit that he deserves for it and to stop this Stalingrad of the 21st century. And so the optics were bad, there was misunderstanding, but there's still a deal to be made that's beneficial to both Ukraine and us.
As the tumultuous saga of the Trump-Zelensky mineral deal continues to unfold, historian and commentator Victor Davis Hanson offers a glimmer of optimism, asserting that despite the fiery Oval Office clash on February 28th, the two leaders are tantalizingly close to sealing the agreement, with only a couple of sticking points remaining. Hanson argues that Zelensky's reluctance to announce a settled deal stems from unpreparedness rather than irreconcilable differences, suggesting that a US-Ukraine partnership leveraging Ukraine's mineral wealth could still emerge as a strategic win for both nations. With Zelensky now in Europe, rallying support, and Trump standing firm on his terms, the path to resolution remains open, potentially paving the way for a ceasefire that could halt the devastating Russo-Ukrainian conflict. After 3 years and 1.5 million casualties, the world watches anxiously, hoping this deal might finally signal an end to enough war.